How often do you come across these terms, right wing and left wing?
Left wing, right wing,
Left wing, left wing.
Here's the thing. The origin of these terms start with the French Revolution. And the truth is, money, finances, and economics helped shape this revolution and eventually also shaped how we think about right-wing and left-wing politics today. So how did the French Revolution begin? Well, picture this. It's the summer of 1789, and France, the most powerful nation in Europe, is in bad shape. France is pouring money out of the country, aiding the American revolutionaries, impacting Britain quite a lot. However, this really isn't a victory for France in that sense, because get this, they were almost bankrupt. And around the same time, drought and disease devastated the countryside. Food prices were skyrocketing and people were on the verge of riot. In desperate needs of funds, the king's Minister of Finance, Charles Alexandre de Calonne, decided to do something that was unthinkable at the time: to tax the rich. Now, while this was a noble intention, it would indirectly serve as the powder keg that would ignite the French Revolution. Understanding the aristocrats would be displeased with the tax reforms, the king summoned the Estates General. This was an assembly composed in equal parts of the nobility, the clergy, and the commoners, also referred to as the Third Estate. Prior to this, the Estates General had not been summoned for nearly 2 centuries. The king had hoped that the commoners would come to his aid in pushing through with this reform. It just shows you how out of touch people in power can really be. Anyway, as you can imagine, the commoners had their own grievances. The biggest issue that they had was fairer representation in this assembly. You see, the commoners represented 98% of the French people, and they were the main taxpayers. However, they only had 1/3 of the seats in the assembly. They could be voted out by 2 other bodies in the assembly despite representing 98%. This was because in the assembly, voting was done by status and not by true representation. So when they all met in Versailles, the original purpose of the meeting and the king were ignored. Instead, a fierce verbal battle was waged between the 3 estates on the subject of equal representation. Eventually, the Third Estate won out and the king grudgingly absorbed all 3 orders into the new council, and this was now called the National Assembly. But this didn't please the common people. Instead, it only empowered them to demand more rights, by force if necessary. The king and the nobility were in a weak situation, and it was high time that people threw off these last vestiges of feudalism. The first event that kicked off the revolution was the storming of Bastille. This was a royal fortress and prison, and its capture was both practical and symbolic. The rioters were able to seize weapons, and this dealt a powerful moral blow to the king's authority. Soon enough, riots began to break out all over the country. All that pent-up anger was beginning to let loose as common people burned and looted the homes of the rich and powerful. It was only a matter of a few months that France transformed from a society where these elites, these noblemen, were untouchable, to now a society where they were almost extinct. They ceased to exist as a social class. Now you're probably wondering, what does all of this have to do with right-wing and left-wing in terms of politics? You see, while the revolution was happening, the National Assembly was busy deciding how to navigate the new political reality. You see, feudalism was formally abolished. A new constitution had to be made, reflecting the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. So while all this was happening, people started to ask this question: what about the king? They had to decide how much power the king was going to have in this new order. Those who wanted the king to have a veto on any laws sat on the right side of the assembly, and those who wanted him to be stripped of any power sat on the left. That's where the term right-wing and left-wing truly comes from. Eventually, in this instance, the right-wing faction won the debate. The king managed to keep his power of veto and right to appoint ministers in this new constitution. But the most radical groups in France were feeling resentful. They were unimpressed by all of this, and they just ignored the constitution. They killed the moderates, they arrested the king, and they declared France a republic. They also went on to kill thousands of people. Now, the assembly was replaced by a new body, and this was now called the National Convention. And surprisingly enough, the same seating pattern would repeat on every subsequent session, as new topics flared up and sides had to be picked. Eventually, this became an established practice. Conservatives would sit on the right, and the reformers would sit on the left, and that's how the newspapers also began reporting it. Now, in a short amount of time, these terms, right-wing and left-wing, became less about seating arrangements and more about political alignment within the French society. So the terms survived even as the National Convention was replaced by the Directory, which would in turn be overthrown by Napoleon Bonaparte. It's also interesting to note that all of these changes took place within a span of only 10 years. And these two terms, the right wing and the left wing, became widely common in France in only a short amount of time. But this was only in France. Outside of France, the concept remained pretty much obscure. It was only at the start of the 20th century that the concept started to gain traction in other parts of the world. But there was a reason for it. The 20s and the 30s was a period of time where all over Europe, people were experiencing a similar condition to what France experienced 2 centuries ago. There was economic uncertainty, people wanted radical changes, and various factions competed to take control of the government. It can be observed that the right became more radical, while the left became more liberal in many instances. Those who strove for a compromise, or centrists, so to speak, were simply melted into air. In today's political climate, when one claims to be supporting the right or the left, they usually talk about how much government intervention they want or they support. A very simplistic view of this is that those on the right want less government intervention in society. This means that they want less taxes, less regulation, and less bureaucracy. Instead, they want society to be led by less formal institutions like religion or traditional and local communities. Meanwhile, those on the left would most likely want more interventions. This means more taxes, more regulations, and more bureaucracy in the sense that they wanted their government to have more of a role in establishing social norms. This means handling stuff like welfare, reducing inequality, and providing universal services. Now, the history of the left wing and the right wing started as a single government issue, but now it's evolved into this global political force shaping democracies worldwide. And in some countries, we effectively see that democracy is a two-party state. It's a very simplistic view of looking at it, but it helps to understand how the concept of right wing and left wing shaped all of this. Now, which side is more effective really depends on the respective governments and how they utilize their power. But knowing that this all started with the French Revolution of all things, which in turn was kicked off because of how people were frustrated with financial management and regulations, is pretty interesting. It gives us a really good perspective and window into how the past shapes the present.